It began with a high dash 5, not the kind exchanged at a winning goal or a triumphant return, but one captured in the casual warmth of a family camping trip, the sort of image that would later seem too perfect, too suspended in time, to have been real. Paxton Concaid's smile in the photograph is broad, the kind of quiet pride an uncle reserves for his favorite niece. 7-year-old Zariah Vance beams back at him, her small hand meeting his in the air above the lime-green foam sleeping mat. That rested across the tailgate of his customized white pickup. The truck's bed was crowned by a dome tent of bright royal blue, flaring against the dark firs behind them. It was August 14th, 2010. The sky above the treetops was a pale wash of blue, the kind that promises a cool night. Paxton 46 had been meticulous about this trip, as he was about most things. His sister Era, Zariah's mother, had driven up with her husband, Tristan, earlier that day to help them set up camp before heading back to Seattle for a rare dinner reservation. Era had taken the picture moments before she and Tristan left, the scent of pine and the low murmur of an easy day in the mountains trailing in their wake. By 10 o'clock that night, the glow of that afternoon would feel a world away. Era first. Called her brother's cell at 9:07 p.m. It rang to voicemail. She waited 10 minutes, tried again. Same result. Paxton always checked in, even when he was out in remote areas. It didn't take chances, not with Zariah along. Tristan tried to ease her nerves, suggesting the obvious. A dead zone. A phone. Battery run dry. But Era knew the area. Clearing wasn't deep wilderness. Such service might be patchy, but not silent. By the third unanswered call, the cold edge of dread had settled in. They drove back into the mountains under a moonless sky, the darkness thick between the hairpin curves. Gravel crunched beneath their tires as they pulled into the clearing, empty, no truck, no tent, no chairs around the small fire ring Paxton had dug earlier. Just tire impressions in the dirt where the vehicle had been, already softening under. The night air, it was as if the campsite had been erased by midnight. They were at the sheriff's office, pale and stunned, filing a missing persons report with too few details to make sense of. The search began with urgency at first light. Ground teams combing undergrowth, helicopters scanning for the white gleam of a truck or the blue of a tent. Everyone assumed they'd find an accident, a wrong turn, a skid down, an embankment. But there were no broken guardrails, no torn earth, no sign of the vehicle anywhere along the obvious routes. By the end of the first week, nothing, not a scrap of clothing, not a food wrapper, not a trace. That was when the speculation started. People whispered about Paxton's recent divorce, about the new woman in his life, about whether the strain had been too much. Era shut it all down. She knew her brother, knew he would never vanish willingly, never take Zariah into danger, but the weeks stretched into months. Search resources dwindled. By winter, the case was quietly moved to the cold files. Joining the ranks of other vanishings in the Cascades, names etched in local memory, but absent from sight. For Ara and Tristan, the absence became a fixture. In their home, Zariah's room remained untouched, her magenta baseball cap still on the hook, her favorite stuffed fox still on the pillow. Birthdays passed with a quiet cake and candles, neither of them could bear to blow out. Then, 5 years later, a man in a brightly colored wingsuit hurled himself from a cliff in the North Cascades. In the seconds between freefall and parachute, deployment caught something on his helmet camera that would tear the lid off the silence. A rust-stained white pickup, crushed and canted on a grassy ledge halfway down an impossible granite face. A scrap of faded blue fabric snagged in the wreckage. Ghosts of that high five had been waiting for them all along. Jarek Bannon didn't know the name Paxton Concaid when he zipped up his orange and green wingsuit on the morning of July 22nd, 2015. He wasn't thinking about cold cases, or missing children, or any of the ghosts the Cascades keep hidden in. Their Deagleys. He was chasing a line. Base jumping wasn't a sport for R. Jarek, it was an obsession carved from years of skydiving, cliff diving, and a lifetime spent measuring risk, not in if, but in when. That morning, he stood at the lip of a granite monster, a sheer wall of stone dropping thousands of feet into a valley carpeted in shadow and mist. The exit point was remote, hours from any trailhead, reachable only by a half-forgotten service. Road that terminated in a scramble over boulders. The wind was steady, cloud cover low, GoPro running. He jumped. In the blur of acceleration, the cliff face became his horizon. Gray rock, green moss, the fleeting smear of a bird startled into flight. Then, for a split second, a shape that didn't belong. White, dulled by rust. Angled wrong against the ledge. Something about it registered in the hindbrain. Before his conscious mind could catalog it, by the time his parachute bloomed and he hit the valley floor, the image was a splinter in his thoughts. Back at his truck, he scrubbed through the footage, until he found the frame, zoomed in. The resolution made the moment mercilessly clear. A pickup. Crumpled, as if dropped from the sky, one corner of its cab driven deep into the grassy shelf. The white paint was pitted with rust blooms, the tires rotted to ribbons. And there, snagged on a bent strut, was a strip of fabric that had once been blue. He marked the coordinates and drove until he had cell service. By dusk, the file was in the inbox of a Washington State police sergeant, who had been working long enough to know exactly what he was looking at. The call to the sheriff's office was short and cold. "I think we found the Concaid truck. Getting to the ledge was another matter." From above, the wreckage was barely a thumbprint against the vastness of the granite face. From below it was invisible, shielded by the pitch of the cliff, and the swell of trees at the base. The only viable approach was vertical, from the ridgeline down. That meant ropes, anchors, and the kind of high-angle recovery team that spent most of its time pulling climbers out of bad falls. They set up base on the ridge under a sky the color of lead. The wind up there had teeth, snatching at every unsecured strap, every coil of rope. When the first man went over the edge, the silence below him was total, broken only by the clink of carabiners and the small dry fall of rock into the void. Hours later, they were standing on the ledge with the truck itself. Time and gravity had done their work. The metal was oxidized and brittle under the fingertips. The cab was compacted inward, a collapse that left almost no interior space intact. Moss had colonized the wheel wells, and a sapling leaned out from the truck bed like a green flag. But the blue fabric, what remained of a tent, was still there, clinging stubbornly to a crumpled panel, the VIN plate. Once cleaned of rust and dirt, confirmed what everyone already suspected. Paxton Concaid's truck had been here for 5 years, and it was empty. No bodies, no bones, no trace of the man or the child who had been missing since that August night, which meant only one thing. It hadn't been an accident. Investigators traced the narrow, overgrown service road that clung to the ridge above, led to a clearing, barely wide enough to maneuver a vehicle into position. From that point, the drop was unbroken, straight to the ledge where the truck now rested. At the lip, they found old tire scarring in the rock, and on the mangled rear bumper of the pickup, once it was examined on site, they found something that changed the investigation entirely. A set of deep horizontal scrapes in the metal, their paint-filled grooves unlike anything the fall could have caused. The transferred paint was an industrial gray, the kind used on heavy equipment, not passenger vehicles, with embedded particles of high-grade steel alloy. Someone had pushed the truck over, deliberately that night. In the sheriff's office war room, they pinned the new photographs to the corkboard, where Paxton and Zariah's smiling faces had been fading under 5 years of dust. The evidence was no longer about a missing persons case. It was about a homicide, and possibly an abduction. The blue fabric on the ledge was proof that the tent had been with the truck when it went over. But the absence of Paxton and Zariah inside it raised the most dangerous question yet. If Zariah had survived the night her uncle was killed, where had she'd been for the last 5 years, and who had kept her there? The forensic lab's report landed on the lead investigator's desk 3 days after the ledge recovery. It was short, clinical, and devastatingly precise. The gray paint on Paxton Concaid's bumper wasn't just any industrial coating. It was an epoxy-based, corrosion-resistant finish typically used on custom-fabricated push bars. heavy recovery rigs, and specialized machinery built for extreme environments. It wasn't something you could buy at a hardware store. It was the kind of finish, applied in only a handful of fabrication shops in the Pacific Northwest. One of those shops was where Paxton had worked. The realization came like a slow turn of a vice. It meant whoever had forced the truck over the cliff had not only access to specialized equipment, they had the skill to build it, the opportunity to get close without suspicion, and possibly a personal reason for doing so. Detectives started quietly interviews with Paxton's old coworkers, most of whom still remembered him fondly. He was described as even-tempered, reliable, a craftsman with a gift for metalwork and vehicle customization. No one spoke of grudges or bad blood, but the name came up more than once, and when it did, there was always a slight hesitation before it was spoken. Jasper Redcliffe, a man in his late 30s, back in 2010. Solitary, technically brilliant, and almost pathologically private. He'd been in the same fabrication bay as Paxton for years, known for precision work, but also for a certain intensity that made others avoid lingering conversation. One woman, Paxton's then-girlfriend Isolde Aor, recalled meeting him. Once at a company barbecue, he stared at me the whole time, she told detectives. Not just watching like he was memorizing my face. Paxton had brushed it off, saying Jasper was just awkward. Dada remembered something else. After that barbecue, Redcliffe began asking about her, not to her, but to others in the shop. Little questions, casual seeming, threaded. With something more possessive than curious, it hadn't gone unnoticed by Paxton. But his reaction had been mild annoyance, not alarm. That was the fatal miscalculation. Investigators pivoted hard. If Redcliffe had an unhealthy fixation on Isolde, Paxton would have been an obstacle. And if he had access to the shop's paint, steel, and heavy-duty rigs, he had the means to turn obsession into violence. The question was how to prove it. A young detective, digging through old company records, stumbled across something overlooked. In the original investigation, GPS logs from the shop's fleet vehicles. The company kept them for route tracking and maintenance, and in 2010, one of those vehicles had been assigned to Redcliffe. When they pulled the archived data, a sickening pattern emerged. 4 weeks before the disappearance, Redcliffe's service truck had made repeated, seemingly unnecessary trips into the Cascades, including the area where Paxton liked to camp. Sometimes the truck would linger for hours on lonely spur roads. On the night Paxton and Zariah vanished, the GPS showed the service truck leaving Seattle, heading straight to the campsite area, then detouring deep into the mountains to a little-used service road on the cliff's edge. It stayed there for 45 minutes before heading back toward civilization. That was the exact launch point of the truck's final fall. A week after the data surfaced, they found the second missing piece, maintenance logs for Redcliffe's service vehicles showing that, just days after the disappearance, the front bumper and push bar had been replaced due to damage sustained on a job site, as the damaged parts had been scrapped. No physical evidence remained, but the paint, the GPS trail, motive, it was enough to shift Redcliffe from person of interest to prime suspect. The case file thickened with every hour of surveillance. Redcliffe, now living in a narrow apartment above an industrial block, still worked at the same shop. He was quiet, methodical, and never varied his routine. Had a child in his life, no friends, no visitors. If Zariah was alive, she wasn't anywhere near his home. That left one possibility. She was hidden somewhere, he thought. No one would ever look. Redcliffe's job gave him keys and unfettered access to remote facilities all over the state, pumping stations, relay towers, decommissioned industrial sites. In late 2010, a few months after the disappearance, he had quietly leased one such site, a shuttered water treatment plant deep in the wilderness, reachable only by a gated service road. The plant was sprawling, fenced, and riddled with underground chambers and tunnels. Its official use was equipment storage. Unofficially, it was a fortress. By the time the tactical planning began, the investigators were operating under two parallel assumptions: that Zariah might be inside, and that Redcliffe would be prepared to defend the place. The breach date was set for early March 2016. The convoy rolled up the gated service road under the cover of a moonless, bitter March night. Headlights were masked, radios low. Even at a crawl, the gravel made an accusing crunch under the tires. The water treatment facility rose from the darkness like a concrete citadel. Vast tanks, rusted catwalks, yawning intake structures, and a central blockhouse crouched behind razor wire. From the tree line, the tactical team took in the layout. This wasn't just a building, it was a machine. And Jasper Redcliffe had lived inside it for years. They cut the outer locks in silence. Inside the fence, the ground smelled faintly of ozone and stagnant water. The first team moved toward the administrative wing. The second angled for the main filtration hall. The third waited in reserve. Every man and woman carried breaching tools. Every door was a potential choke point. At 2:17, the breach began. The interior was a maze of echoing corridors, skeletal. Steel stairs and huge cylindrical tanks that loomed in the dark. Somewhere deep in the complex, a motor roared to life. Redcliffe knew they were here. The floor under Team 2 shuddered as a massive valve slammed shut in the pipes below. In another corridor, a blast of steam hissed from ruptured vent lines, filling the air with heat and fog so thick the beams of the flashlights were swallowed whole. Heavy steel fire doors clanged down in the main hall, sealing off the direct route to the plant's core. Redcliffe was playing the facility like an instrument, using every mechanical system to slow them, to split them, to make them vulnerable. Team 1 forced their way past a jammed security door into what had once been a control room. The walls were lined with obsolete panels and gauges, many rewired into something else entirely. Whoever had lived here had gutted and rebuilt sections of the plant, shaping it to their needs. A radio crackled. Movement. Second-level filtration chamber. Team 2 took the stairs 2 at a time, boots ringing against metal. They found Redcliffe on a catwalk, a length of steel pipe gripped like a club. His eyes were wild, but not panicked, calculating, measuring. Jasper, drop it. I swung. First, the pipe glanced off a ballistic helmet, the clang rattling in the air. 2 officers tackled him hard against the safety rail, twisting the weapon from his hands. He fought not with flailing panic, but with focused, bone-bruising force before being slammed to the grate and cuffed. Even restrained, he said nothing. Not a word. With Redcliffe secured, the search accelerated. Every locked room was a priority. Every panel that looked like it didn't belong was tested. In the far end of the underground level, behind a section of false wall, they found it. A reinforced motorized door. It seems flush with the concrete. A breacher's charge split the lock. The room inside was blindingly lit, spotless, almost sterile. Shelves lined with neatly organized supplies. Cot made with military precision. Books, puzzles, and toys, but all worn, aged. Nothing new for years. At the small desk in the corner sat a girl. She did not turn at the noise, did not flinch at the light or the armed men in black fatigues filling the doorway. Zariah, one of them asked, voice low. Nothing. Her hair was long, pale against her face, her skin almost translucent under the fluorescent lights. She stared at the blank wall in front of her, as though waiting for some unseen signal to move. One medic approached slowly, kneeling. You're safe now. We're here to take you home. She didn't answer. In the corridor outside, someone muttered, She doesn't even know we're here. They had found her. But what they had rescued was a body holding 5 years of silence. The extraction was careful, almost ceremonial. She was wrapped in a thermal blanket, shielded from the cold night air, and walked, not carried out of the plant. Not because she resisted, but because she moved mechanically, each step deliberate. Like a soldier following drill, Redcliffe was loaded into a separate transport. Even in the glare of the floodlights, its expression was unreadable. For the first time in 5 years, Paxton Concaid's niece was outside the walls that had held her. But the question everyone was too afraid to voice was whether she could ever leave them in her mind. The drive from the mountains to Seattle was silent, except for the low rumble of the tires. Zariah sat in the back seat of the medic transport, wrapped in a blanket, eyes fixed on nothing. The medic, riding with her, tried now and then a question. A comment, even a simple, Do you need water? But there was no response, no flicker of recognition. For 5 years, her world had been reduced to one man's voice, one man's rules, one enclosed space. The sudden sensory overload, the lights, the noise of radios, the movement of strangers seemed to push her further inward, into a place no one else could reach. At the trauma facility, she was moved to a private, soundproofed room. Specialists were waiting. Pediatric trauma psychologists, forensic interviewers, physicians trained to detect the hidden injuries of captivity. They examined her with a gentleness that made the silence in the room almost unbearable. Physically, she was thin, but not malnourished. No broken bones, no visible scars. Out. But her reactions, the absence of any, told the deeper story. No startle reflex. No instinctive glance toward the sound of her name. It was as if she'd been taught that the only safe response to any intrusion was stillness. Ara and Tristan arrived within hours, faces tight with a hope they couldn't quite let themselves feel. They were led to the door, warned about what to expect. She may not recognize you, the psychologist said quietly. She may not be ready to make contact. Inside, the room felt too bright. Zariah sat in a chair by the window, her knees drawn up slightly. Eyes on the pattern of the floor tiles, Era crossed the space slowly, knelt beside her, reached for her hand. Zariah, it's Mom. The girl flinched a tiny automatic recoil and turned her head, but not toward her mother. Her gaze slid past, like Ara was a shadow on the wall. Tristan's voice cracked when he said, "We've been looking for you, honey. We never stopped. Nothing." Not a blink. Era's hand stayed where it was, open, waiting. The space between. Mother and daughter was suddenly the heaviest thing in the room. While doctors and family tried to reach her in Seattle, the investigation was still active back in the Cascades. The recovery of the truck and Zariah's rescue had given detectives the leverage to press Redcliffe in custody. But he spoke to no one. Not about Zariah, not about Paxton. The GPS logs from the night of the disappearance still had one unexplained. Stop after the time on the cliff top, before the long drive back to the city. It was deep in the forest, near an overgrown spur road, the vehicle stationary for hours. A cadaver dog team was sent in. The ground there was dense with pine litter and moss, the kind that holds the smell of the forest and little else. But one of the dogs broke from its handler, nose low, tail stiff, circling a boulder at the base of a slope. The digging began. The soil was damp, layered with needles. 3 feet down, they found bone. The skeletal remains were consistent with an adult, male. Dental records confirmed what Ara and Tristan already suspected but could never have said aloud. It was Paxton, blunt force trauma to the skull, no defensive wounds. The medical examiner's report would later conclude that he'd likely been killed at or near the campsite before the truck was ever moved. When the call came, Yara stepped into the hallway outside Zariah's room. She pressed her forehead to the wall as the detective's voice gave her the words in plain, unsoftened order. "We found him. We're bringing him home." For the first time since the rescue, she cried soundless, shaking sobs that left her throat raw. Inside the room, Zariah didn't look up. The public story was simple. A missing child found alive after 5 years. Her captor in custody, her uncle's body recovered. Headlines called it a miracle with a shadow. But inside the hospital, the reality was that a rescue was not the same as a return. Zariah was safe from Redcliffe. She was not yet free. Jasper Redcliffe sat in the interview room like the walls were his, hands cuffed, eyes steady, breathing slow. The detectives tried every tactic: silence, pressure, the quiet recitation of the evidence, the GPS logs, the industrial paint, the damage to the company push bar, the grave in the woods. Redcliffe's expression never changed. When the homicide charge was read, he didn't blink. When they added kidnapping and aggravated abuse, still nothing. The only movement came when they mentioned Zariah by name, a fractional tightening of the jaw, gone before the next syllable left the detective's mouth. It was enough to tell them that whatever he'd done to her wasn't just about removing a witness. There had been a design to it. The prosecuting attorney, Linda Caro, knew. The case was strong in evidence but fragile in witness testimony. They had the physical link, the paint transfer, the GPS trail, recovered remains, but the only living witness had been molded by half. A decade in Redcliffe's control, Zariah hadn't spoken since her rescue. It's not a word to her parents, her doctors, or her therapists. Caro pushed for time. If Zariah could find her voice before the trial, her testimony could bury Redcliffe beyond appeal. But forcing it too soon could push her deeper into retreat. The forensic team reconstructed the crime with brutal precision. On the evening of August 14, 2010, Redcliffe arrived at the campsite while Era and Tristan were still in Seattle. He approached. In the company truck, equipped with the custom-built push bar coated in that distinctive industrial epoxy, Paxton never made it past the first confrontation. The autopsy suggested a single blow to the head with a heavy, flat object enough to drop him instantly. Whether Zariah saw it happen was unknown. Redcliffe then loaded Paxton's body into the truck, drove to the secluded burial site, covered it with enough soil and debris to disguise it from casual discovery. From there, he took the truck. With the tent still attached up the overgrown service road to the cliff edge, positioned it and rammed it over. The fall crumpled the vehicle into an unrecognizable wreck. The ledge's isolation would have made recovery impossible without the freak angle of a base jumper's camera. After that, GPS logs placed him heading away from the cliff too, somewhere no one had been able to trace for 5 years. Until the raid. In the hospital, Zariah's days fell into a careful rhythm. Morning check-ins, light meals, short sessions with Dr. Helen Mars, a child psychologist specializing in long-term captivity. Mars didn't push for speech. Instead, she worked with gestures, drawing, and small, controlled exposures to new stimuli. It was in the second week that something shifted. Mars had given Zariah a simple task: draw anything she wanted with a box of colored pencils. 4:20 minutes, the girl's hand moved slowly across the page. When she turned it around, it wasn't a house, or a tree, or a family. It was a truck, white, with a blue shape on top, and on one side a figure standing beside it. The figure's head was a blank oval. Mars slid the drawing toward her gently. "Who's this?" she asked. Zariah didn't speak. The faceless figure once with the tip of her pencil, then looked away. Caro saw the sketch a day later. It wasn't a confession, but it was a crack in the wall, proof that the memories were there. It's close enough to surface. If they could find a way to make Zariah feel safe enough to tell the rest, the trial wouldn't just convict Redcliffe. It would give Paxton's death and her years in captivity, one thing they'd both been denied, a public truth. Redcliffe's defense attorney was already hinting at an insanity plea. It didn't matter to Caro. She wanted him locked away with no daylight left in his life. What she didn't say, not in court, not even to her team, was that she also wanted Zariah to see him there. To know the man who'd stolen half her life would never have another minute of hers. The courthouse felt colder than it should have in late spring. It wasn't the air conditioning, it was the way people went quiet when Jasper Redcliffe was let in. She called at the wrists, dressed in the muted orange of county detention. The first pretrial hearing was procedural, but the atmosphere was loaded. Families of other missing persons sat in the gallery, drawn by the case's grim notoriety. Reporters filled the back row, their pens and cameras poised for the smallest flicker of drama. Redcliffe didn't give them one. His eyes stayed fixed ahead, jaw tight, expression unreadable. Linda Caro, reviewing her notes at the prosecution table, already knew the defense strategy. They were going to push an alternate narrative. No witness to the killing, no forensic evidence directly tying Redcliffe to Paxton's death, no proof that Zariah had been taken against her will. They would imply that she had been in his care, fed and housed. Her silence a choice rather than the result of psychological conditioning. It was disgusting, but it was dangerous too. Without Zariah's voice, the jury would be forced to interpret the absence for themselves. An absence, Caro knew, could be twisted. Dr. Helen Mars had been working quietly in the background. Her sessions with Zariah had shifted from silent drawing to nonverbal exercises, showing images and gauging reaction. letting the girl rearrange simple picture cards to tell a sequence of events. On the 20th session, Mars laid out a new card set: a forest, a truck, a man with a raised hand, and a tent. Zariah hesitated for a long time before arranging them. She put the man and the truck first, then the forest. But she left the tent card to the side, separate from the sequence. Mars leaned in slightly. "Where were you when this happened?" Zariah didn't speak, but she pointed at the forest card, then at herself. It was the first time she'd placed herself in the narrative. Mars reported it immediately. Caro listened without interrupting, her mind already moving. This wasn't testimony yet. It was closer. The breakthrough, when it came, was nothing Mars could have planned. 3 weeks before the trial, Era and Tristan were visiting the trauma facility. The staff had been cautious about letting them spend extended time together. Zariah still kept her distance physically, though she no longer recoiled from their presence. That afternoon, Era brought a photo album. Not of vacations or birthdays, but of ordinary days. Zariah feeding ducks at the park, painting in the kitchen, playing with the neighbor's dog. One image stopped the girl's page-turning hand, a candid Ara had taken from the porch. Paxton. And Zariah, in the driveway, high-fiving beside the loaded truck. Zariah's lips parted slightly, a small inhale. And then, so quietly Ara almost thought she imagined it, came a single word. "Uncle?" Ara froze. Tristan's hand clenched on the arm of his chair. Zariah didn't look up from the picture. She just traced Paxton's outline with one finger, the words still hanging in the air like a fragile thread. When Mars heard, she didn't push to make the girl repeat it. The fact that she had spoken at all, and that the word carried recognition, was enough. Caro adjusted her trial strategy that night. Even if Zariah never took the stand, the jury would hear that word. They would hear it from the person it mattered to most, her mother. Redcliffe's attorneys filed motions to suppress almost everything: the GPS data, the paint analysis, even the photos of the truck on the ledge. All were denied. The trial date was set. The trial opened on a Monday morning that smelled of rain. By 8 a.m., the hall outside King County Superior Court was crowded. Reporters with cameras, true crime bloggers with notepads, and strangers drawn by the headlines about the Cascade's captivity case. Inside, the air was taut. The jurors filed in, faces carefully neutral. Jasper Redcliffe sat between his attorneys, spine straight, eyes fixed on the judge's bench, as though the rest of the room didn't exist. When Linda Caro rose for the state's opening statement, her voice was even deliberate, not the theatrical pitch of a TV drama, but the steady weight of someone placing evidence brick by brick. "This case," she began, "is about control. The control one man took over another's life, and over a child's life, for 5 years. Told them about August 14th, 2010, the camping trip. It's a high-five photograph, the unanswered calls. She walked them through the physical evidence, the truck on the ledge, the paint transfer, the GPS logs, the grave in the forest. She spoke Paxton Concaid's name like it was a promise, and she said, 'Zariah's with the kind of care you give to something fragile.' And then she said the word uncle, and let it sit there. The jurors leaned in almost imperceptibly. The defense followed with a quieter, insidious approach. They conceded nothing, not the murder, not the kidnapping. They framed Redcliffe as a misunderstood man who looked after a child when her uncle couldn't, who had kept her safe in a world he believed was unsafe. They didn't say where Paxton had gone, or why his body had been found buried in the woods. They simply planted the idea that there was no direct proof of Redcliffe killing him, and that Zariah's silence might mean something other than fear. It was a calculated insult, wrapped in a soft voice. Over the next week, the prosecution built its case like a spine, the forensic expert on the industrial epoxy and steel alloy, the GPS analyst tracing the company truck's movements to the cliff and back, the recovery team leader who had rappelled to the ledge and found the truck empty, the medical examiner detailing Paxton's fatal head injury. Each witness added vertebrae to the story, until the shape of it was unmistakable. Paxton's death wasn't an accident, and Zariah's captivity wasn't protection. Zariah was not. called to testify. It had been decided long before that her mental state couldn't withstand cross-examination. But on the 10th day of trial, she came to court for the first time. Seated quietly between Era and Tristan in the gallery's front row, the jurors noticed her immediately. She was pale, her hair pulled back, her hands folded in her lap. She didn't look at Redcliffe. She didn't look at the jury. Her gaze was fixed on the photograph on the courtroom screen, the hi-fi by the truck. When Caro asked the recovery team leader to identify the blue fabric found with the wreckage, Raya's fingers twitched. She whispered something into Era's sleeve. Era's throat worked, and she asked the bailiff if she could repeat it for the record. The judge allowed it. She said, "That's ours." There was a shift in the jury box, small but unmistakable. A moment when the abstract weight of 5 years in captivity became human. Redcliffe didn't turn to look at her. A jaw moved, a brief grind of teeth, before he returned his eyes to the table. Caro didn't press the moment. She let it stand, the sound of Zariah's voice in the courtroom. Even if only through her mother, the defense called fewer witnesses. Leaning on the absence of direct testimony and the lack of DNA at the burial site, but the jury had already seen the photographs, heard the timelines, and watched the girl in the front row react to the evidence with the subtle, involuntary recognition of someone who'd lived it. By the time closing arguments came, Caro's voice was iron. Silence is not consent. Captivity is not care. And a man who buries your brother in the woods and throws his truck off a cliff is not your protector. He is your captor. The jury filed out just before noon on a Thursday. 12 faces, closed and unreadable. Disappearing into the deliberation room with the evidence binders and their own private impressions of the last 3 weeks in the gallery, Era kept her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. Tristan sat beside her, eyes fixed on a spot in the carpet. Zariah was not in the room. Her therapist had agreed that whatever the verdict, she shouldn't hear it in the crush of strangers and cameras. Redcliffe sat with the same stillness he'd held since the first day, except for the small, rhythmic tapping of one finger against his thigh, a tell so subtle it might have been nothing, or it might have been the only outward sign that the control he clung to was fraying. The weight stretched into ours. The air in the courtroom thickened with the smell of coffee and damp coats. At 4:42 p.m., the bailiff stepped into the hall and said, "We have a verdict." Everyone rose when the jury came back in. Caro stood at the prosecution table, her hands flat, shoulders squared. The foreperson didn't hesitate. On the charge of first-degree murder, guilty. On the charge of kidnapping in the first degree, guilty. On the charge of unlawful imprisonment and abuse, guilty. Each word landed like the steady pound of a hammer driving a nail home. Ara's eyes closed. Her shoulders sagged forward. Just for a moment, as if she'd been holding her breath for 5 years and finally let some of it go. Redcliffe showed nothing. No protest, no shock. Just the same rigid stare at the bench, like the life sentence that was about to be handed down had been inevitable all along. At sentencing, the following week, Caro didn't waste her time on moral condemnation. She let the facts speak. The calculated nature of the crime, the deliberate disposal of evidence, the sustained captivity of a child. The judge gave him life without the possibility of parole. No appeal would shorten it. No parole board would ever see him. He was led out of the courtroom in chains, the door closing behind him with the heavy click of a lock that would not be turned again. That night, Ara sat with Zariah in her hospital room. The news had been kept simple for her. The man who hurt. Uncle Paxton would never come back. Zariah was coloring, something she'd begun doing more often, and didn't look up when Ara sat beside her. "It's over," Ara said softly. The crayon paused. For a long time, Zariah kept her eyes on the page. Then she turned, just enough to meet her mother's gaze, and said in a voice barely above a whisper, "Okay, it wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't healing, but it was an answer." In the months after the trial, the headlines faded. Reporters moved on to newer tragedies, fresher scandals. The cameras stopped calling, but in Ara and Tristan's house, the air was still shaped by absence. Zariah came home in stages. First on day visits from the trauma facility, then weekend stays, and finally, after nearly 7 months, full-time. She slept with the door open and the hall light on. She spoke rarely, choosing her moments carefully, and when she laughed, the first time Era heard it, it was quiet, almost surprised, as though she didn't quite trust the sound. Her room was the same as it had been in 2010, the magenta baseball cap still hung on its hook. The stuffed fox still lay on the pillow. But the girl who came back to it was not the girl who had left. Ara kept the high-five photo in a wooden frame on the dresser. She never pushed it toward Zariah, never asked her to talk about it, but she caught her looking at it sometimes, not for long, just a glance in passing, like checking a landmark in unfamiliar territory. One evening, months later, Zariah picked it up herself. "That was the last time," she said quietly. Era swallowed. "The last time." "What?" "The last time I saw him happy." She set the frame down without looking at her mother. Nara didn't press. The grave marker in the small cemetery outside Monroe bore only Paxton's name. The dates, and a short line Era had chosen herself. He stayed until she couldn't see. Him, it was the closest she could come to explaining without explaining. The way she believed he'd shielded Zariah in those last seconds at the campsite. Jasper, a Redcliffe's name surfaced once more, a terse line in a corrections department bulletin, transferred to a maximum security facility in eastern Washington. No contact privileges? Era read it without satisfaction. Some people could not be punished enough to matter. In early autumn, Zariah joined Era on a drive back into the foothills. They didn't go near the old campsite, Era knew better, but they stopped at a trailhead where the air smelled of pine and damp earth. Halfway down the path, Zariah reached for Era's hand. No words, just the warmth of it and the steady grip of someone deciding, step by step, to move forward. The high-five photo stayed on the dresser. It was still both a wound and a monument. A reminder that one day can hold everything. Joy, danger, and the moment when the ground shifts forever. But now, sometimes when Zariah passed it, she touched the corner of the frame with her fingertips, like checking to make sure it was still there. Like checking to make sure she was still here.